It is late August in Alabama in 1992. I'm dressed in jeans and a nice rugby shirt, its large stripes and white collar standing out against the t-shirt shorts and college sloppiness all around me. Around my neck is a leather cord with big pony beads that one of the twins made for me because we'd been making them on a mission trip to Eastern Kentucky. I've been wearing it ever since I moved to Auburn because I'd come there just a few weeks before, and the only people I'd really talked to were forced conversations that I've had after calculus. And I'm missing my friends and missing my home. I'm standing on the lawn of the BCM, the Baptist Campus Ministry, and I'm dripping with sweat. Sweat is running down my face and running down the back of my shirt because it's summer in Alabama. Because I didn't know where I still didn't know where I was allowed to park, and I'd parked in the stadium parking lot over a mile away on the other side of campus. And I'd walked through the hot Alabama afternoon with my jeans and my nice shirt and my Bible and my notebook, because dressed up like I was going to Sunday night church. What I found wasn't a church like anything I knew before. It wasn't even church at all, actually, at least not that night. It was what they called the lawn party, the first of 8 of them that I would attend before leaving Auburn. And it would be at one of these just a couple of years later that I would frighten the girl who would later become my wife. I didn't know what the lawn party, I didn't know that it was actually a party. I assumed it was just a name that they used to get people to come, or at the very least, if it was a party, it would be a party where people still acted like they were at church. You see, I grew up in a church that had meetings, multiple meetings, about whether or not it was acceptable to clap when someone sang a special music in church. Sidebar, it was acceptable as long as you're clapping along, but not if you clap after, because clapping along, you're joining into the worship, and if you're clapping after, you're praising the person, just FYI. I don't know if they ever voted to change that. That was a long time ago. But I also went to church that thought that Amy Grant and Stephen Curtis Chapman were just a little adjacent of the devil's music and probably should be a little suspect. You see, I grew up in that place where you would never wear shorts to church. So I'd walked into this situation in my jeans and my nice shirt with my Bible and my homemade necklace and my floppy skater hair, trying to look like I fit in, but knowing I didn't. I want to just turn around and go home. I want to just walk the mile back to my car and drive through somewhere for food and go back to my apartment alone. But I stick it out. A latent promise to my family that I would go, and a deep need to find a place to fit in keep me standing there on the grass, waiting for someone to notice me. Before long, a staff person finds me and hands me a flyer and tells me all about the weekly meetings. I don't remember anything else as I go through that whole day. I don't remember anyone I talked to, but I know I felt awkward. It was still appealing. On Thursday, I'm back at the BCM. This time I have parked in the BCM parking lot, and I'm much closer, and I'm wearing t-shirts. And I'm wearing a t-shirt, multiple t-shirts. I'm wearing shorts and a t-shirt. I walk into what they call freshman inside, and I'm sorted into a group of students to be my small group. There's this special awkwardness that comes from these small groups in college, especially in college before cell phones, where everyone is away from home and a phone call home costs money. So everyone is trying to find a new place and a new friend and new people. Most of us kids in this group are rolling in out of youth groups. So we're sizing each other up, trying to figure out which of the people is telling us their name and their favorite fruit are just faking the smiles and this whole Jesus thing. 2 weeks later, I'm ready to go back home. I don't tell anyone this. I barely even admit it to myself, but I'm ready to go home. My little Insight group has scheduled to meet for supper before Freshman Insight at a restaurant across the street from the BCM. The only 2 people who show up are me and my Insight leader. Her name was Amy. I don't remember her last name. She was a senior. Sidebar, she left like right after that, graduated. I really do not remember her at all. Her name was Amy. I don't remember her last name. And to this day, she does not know how important it was that she sat and ate with me and talked to me and encouraged me and convinced me to stick around. She doesn't know that she's a big reason why I chose to stay. The other reason I'm there, the other reason that I stuck around was the other reason I stuck around was because it wasn't long before I started making friends and hanging out with these other people, these older students, and being involved in their lives. And every one of the older kids I met and that saw that they weren't faking this Jesus thing. They were off at college. No one was making them be involved, and yet they were there not out of duty, but because they believed. That is what ultimately keeps me around. Seeing people who actually lived like I had always talked. The people in my home church would turn up their noses at the music and the clothes and the loudness of what happened at the BCM, which is really funny because now it's stuff that's really old, it's like 30 years ago. But anyway, they would have. But I learned that the people there loved God. And not only that, they lived out that love. It was something I'd never seen before. It was something I so desperately wanted. I'd shown up that first day looking what I thought a Christian should look like, but feeling like it was all just an act. And I'd seen a group of people who didn't look like any church people that I had known, but after just a few weeks, I realized that they lived what they had actually believed. And that has made all the difference. I tell this story often. Very rarely do I tell this formalized version of the story, maybe once or twice, but I tell the same idea of a story often because it's the story of how I found this idea, this place, these people who weren't just going through the motions, who weren't just saying that they were Christians, but were actually living it out. And who their Christianity wasn't what they were against. It wasn't all the things that they were fighting to defeat. Their Christianity was based on how much they loved and cared and moved in the world. And God was not just an afterthought or not just a Sunday thing. God was involved in every aspect of their lives. And I met those people, and it changed who I was, and it changed what I thought about the world, and it changed how I moved through the world. It made a huge difference for me. And it's one of those older guys, one of those senior guys, took me under his wing in a thing that we called Master Life. Some of you may have done Master Life a long time ago. And I walked through he took me and three other sophomore guys at the time and walked through a whole year of discipling us and teaching us and getting to see him live out his faith and see how that affected me. It made a big difference. So I tell that story often, or a story similar to that, because it's the best way I have to say, hey, by the way, you shouldn't just say you're following Jesus. You actually need to follow Jesus, and it makes a big deal. It's the easiest way I have to say that because I can tell a story of how I saw that and what a difference it made in my life. I also tell that story because Amy noticed that I was hurting, and Amy sat with me and listened to my stories, listened to the problems that I had at school, and she spoke into me encouragement, and it made all the difference. That's what matters, and that they heard my story and speaks into my story. It's a big deal. And so I tell that story for that reason. And I tell that story because stories are what matters. Story is what makes a difference. It's really funny, though, that I tell a variation of that story quite often. And then Nathan, my oldest son, got to school at Auburn, and he met some people, and he goes, Dad, I'm really having a good time. He goes, I really thought everybody at college would just be partying all the time. But all these people really want to care about Jesus and kind of do this God thing. I'm like, dude, I've told this story like a dozen times. I get that maybe you thought you were going to bump into some guy, but there are people there. We've had this conversation. But kids don't listen to their fathers, and we all know that. But anyway, I tell this story because we are wired for story, that we are shaped by story. We are shaped by our story. We are shaped by God's story. And we're shaped by the story that's being told around us. We are people who are shaped by story. So Brother Jason is on vacation. Brother Mark, I found out yesterday morning that Brother Mark was going to not be able to be here. And so I came up to the church and started prepping a lesson. And so it's going to be a little bit more freehand than it normally is today. Just kind of know that. And some of you are really, really upset that Chad told you that you're not going to know what those blanks are. And I understand that. And if you really want to know, I actually know what all the blanks are. You can come up to me and you can fill them in. It's not the message you're going to hear today, but you can have them filled in. And that, because some of you like that. I didn't preach his message because I thought maybe when he comes back, he'll want to preach it again. So I kind of let that go. But we're going to talk about this idea of being shaped by this story, shaped by the stories we tell, shaped by the stories we live, and ultimately shaped by the storyteller who is God. Since people were first people, we've been telling stories. Since people were first created, we have been people who tell stories. It's crafted into who we are. We share the stories of our day. We share the stories of our heart. We tell each other stories that are real, stories that are made up. We entertain with our stories. We learn with our stories. We find our place in the world with stories. We are wired for story. That is who we are. And as Christians, we're not only wired for story, but we are shaped by story. The story that God tells us in the Bible shapes our lives. And not only that, the story of God shapes our world that we go out in. And we are commissioned to be storytellers, telling God's story to the nations. In ancient times, there were storytellers, and they were the ones who would pass down the lore of the community. They would pass down the history of the people, and they would speak to the next generation and make sure the next generation of the storytellers knew the stories. They were keepers of information for sure, but they were also the keepers of the hearts of the people. And that's what we are called to be. We are called to be storytellers, to take these ancient stories of God and weave them into our own story and share it with the world, inviting everyone we meet into the flow of the story. You see, the story of God isn't some static thing that is still and safe and there. No, the story of God is a river, dangerous and wild. And when we are willing to step into it, he invites us to make a difference and join him on this big, long story of his. So turn, if you would, to 1 Samuel chapter 3. 1 Samuel chapter 3. It will not be on the screen. I know we have big fancy screens, but it will not be on the screen. And so if you have a Bible, turn to 1 Samuel chapter 3. If you do not have a Bible, if you have a phone, you at some point in time probably installed that Bible from YouVersion that says Holy Bible on it. And if you want to open that up, know that I'm going to read from the CSB. You probably don't have a CSB translation in front of you. That's fine as well. I promise I'm not going to go too far or too fast. You're going to be figuring it out. But I'm going to read from the CSB today as we look at the story of 1 Samuel chapter 1. I love that the Bible is full of stories. I love that the Bible is full of different types of stories. God could have just given us an instruction manual. The Bible could have been just the instruction manual for life. You know, the Bible could have just been like IKEA instructions. Actually, the Bible could have even been just like, Lego instructions, which don't even have words, they just have pictures. You know what I'm saying? Like you'd have somebody stabbing somebody, a little minifig stabbing another minifig with a big X on it. It's like, don't do that, The Bible could have just been a list of rules. And because God is God, he actually could have put like appendix in there and been like, okay, listen, in 1850, here's some of the sub things that you need to understand. You need to understand that when the horse and carriage starts to arrive, you need to kind of add these things. It's the same story, but we're going to add these things. And he's like, okay, in the 90s, you're going to start to hear about this thing, the internet. And by the late 2000s, when the iPhone comes out, there's all kinds of new rules that we're going to add. They're not really new, but we're going to kind of explain to you how you should deal with people on the internet, because some of you have missed the whole you should love your neighbor thing as soon as we go online. And like the Bible could just say, hey, by the way, here's 6 things you don't want to miss. Don't yell at people on Facebook. The Bible could just have that line. But the Bible doesn't have that line. What the Bible has instead is a story. The Bible is not an instruction book for life. Now, it has instructions for life. It is not a manual of all the different things you should do. It has the manual of how you should live your life, but God did not give us a manual. He did not give us an instruction book. He gave us a story. He gave us a story, and the reason why he gave us a story is because we are not moved by instruction manuals. Instruction manuals do not move our hearts. Now, okay, I think there's probably a couple of you in here that are like, man, I love a good instruction manual. And that's cool, what you're saying. And for you, you've got Leviticus, all right? God gives you like Deuteronomy, Leviticus. He lays the laws out for you. But for most of us, we are not moved by instruction manuals. We are moved by story. And we are inspired by the stories that we see, the stories we hear, and the stories we read, and the story that God tells. And God tells the story of the Bible in this big, epic way, and then he invites us to be a part of it. So in 1 Samuel, we see what we're going to see is the calling of this guy who is going to be the prophet that kind of ties the Israelites from the time of the Judges to the time of Kings. And that's going to be his job. And he's going to get a message, and God is going to come to him and basically commission him to be this prophet. And his first message he's going to have to do is tell this guy you're living with, Eli, that he's a terrible person. His children are going to die and he's going to die. And tell him that God has judged you. That's his first message he's got to go tell. But this is what is happening in this story. That's the facts. God speaks to Samuel. Samuel is told to go tell Eli he's going to die. That's the facts. The Bible doesn't just give us the facts. The Bible tells us a story. In fact, the story actually starts a couple of chapters earlier with Samuel's mom. And Samuel's mom doesn't have a kid, and she's praying for a child, and God hears her prayer, and God gives her Samuel and says, fine, because you've given me a child, I'm going to give him back to you. And he goes and lets him live with Eli and the priest. This is the story that has nothing to do with anything else that God is trying to do, except God is sharing this story and inviting us into this story. That is what it means to follow him. So 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. The boy Samuel served the Lord in Eli's presence. Eli's the high priest guy who's not good. God's going to kill him. Actually, he's going to fall off. He's really fat. He's going to fall off a chair and die. But anyway, just kind of FYI, fun story stuff later that we're not going to get to. But anyway, the boy Samuel served the Lord in Eli's presence. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare and prophetic visions were not widespread. One day, Eli, whose eyesight was failing, was lying in his usual place. Before the lamp of God had gone out, Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was located. Then the Lord called Samuel, and he answered, "Here I am." He ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "I didn't call you," Eli replied. "Go back and lie down." So Samuel, went back and lay down. Once again, verse 6 there. Once again, the Lord called Samuel. Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "I didn't call you, my son," he replied. "Go back and lay down." So now Samuel did not yet know the Lord because the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And once again, for the third time, the Lord called Samuel. He got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." That emphasis is just mine. I don't know if he got frustrated, but my children would have been really mad by then. "Here I am, you called me." And Eli, understanding that the Lord was calling the boy, he told Samuel, "Go and lie down. If he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came, stood there, and called as before, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel responded, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And the Lord said to Samuel, "I'm about to do something in Israel that will cause everyone who hears about it to shudder." I'm giving you this really big, powerful story. I'm giving you this really big, powerful mission. I'm giving you this message that's going to shake the world. God's inviting him to come and be a part of that. And God is inviting us to be a part of that same thing. God has this big, grand story, and he's inviting us to be a part of it. He's saying, God's like, listen, I'm doing something major in the world. I'm inviting you to be a part of it. I'm speaking to you around the world about this story, and it's whispers of the story are happening all around us. Every day as you walk through your day, whispers of God's story are happening all around you. Every day as you go to the store, as you go to school, as you go to work, as you sit in your house, as you scroll the internet, whatever you're doing, whispers of God's story are speaking to you and inviting you, calling you and saying, "Come here. Come here, there's a bigger story over here. There's a larger story over here. There's more over here." And God is inviting us to jump into his story. Just like he was Samuel, he's speaking and he's whispering, and we cannot hear his voice because we don't know his voice, because we haven't listened for his voice, and we keep saying, "Oh, okay." And then finally we realize, oh, these whispers that we feel in our heart, these are God speaking to us. And God is inviting us to a greater story. We lose ourselves in so many small stories. We lose ourselves in so many small stories. I work with teenagers all the time, and always there'll be a teenager that "What do you do all day?" "I sit and play video games all day long." And you're like, "Oh, okay, that's what I do." It's a very small story. I'm not saying it's bad. I play a lot of video games. I've been playing NCAA football 25 a lot. It's a whole lot of fun. Auburn is winning the national championship twice there. The reason why I play there is because in real life they are terrible, okay? But it's a very small story. There's a lot of people who are living in a story of maybe fantasy football. Y'all know anybody who gets really worked up about their fantasy football team? That they're going to go home in just a little bit and they're going to start checking their phone and they don't care what team wins, but they really care that the TJ Metcalf or whatever scores like 6 touchdowns. Like, he lost. I don't care that his team lost. I won. You didn't win. You're involved in a really small story. How many of you know somebody that when the Cats lose, it ruins their day? How many of you know somebody that when Auburn loses, it makes the rest of their week terrible? Not quite there anymore because we're bad all the time. We're living in some really small stories. That we think that this is what matters, that these small things are enough to like ruin our day, that that we are going to be mad about Coach Cal, not anymore, but we're going to be mad about Coach Cal for forever because why? That's not who we are. We don't even play for the team. Most of us haven't even gone to school there. And yet, we let that destroy our day. Why? Because we live in very small stories. How many of us get really worked up when somebody's wrong on the internet? Oh my goodness, somebody on Facebook said something wrong. They said something that was pro something that I'm totally against. And now I'm going to make something. It's like, wow, I've got to tell you why that's wrong. Let me give you 6 Bible verses for why that's terrible. And then the rest of the day, we're just checking our things over and over again, going, you know what they said? And we're right there ready. Why? Because we're living in really small stories. Winning arguments on the internet is a very small story. I'm so proud of you that you can win arguments on the internet. And that's an amazing thing to be able to do, I'm sure. But it's a small story if you're not backing up with joining who God is. It's a small story if you're not backing up with who Jesus is. It's a small story if you're not joining with God and stepping in and saying, you know what, I love the world and I care about the world and I want to take the story of God to the world. We lose ourselves in books. We lose ourselves in things. We lose ourselves in family. We lose ourselves in so many things that are such a small story and that don't really matter. We're all worked up and worried about it. Why? Because we know we should be involved in a bigger story. We know we should be involved in something that matters. We know we should have passion. We understand that because we are wired to be like that. We are wired to be people of story. That's who we're made to be. And we know that somehow we should be involved in something bigger. And the church, me, and other people have just failed to share with us, sometimes just haven't told us that the bigger story that we're supposed to be involved in is the story of God. And not the story of stuff and fantasy and chasing after things that don't matter. The story of God is what matters. And we can be involved in it because we are part of this grand narrative. But it's a scary thing. It is a scary thing to say, you know what, God, I'm going to be a part of your story. Because when we tell God, I want to be a part of your story, it means that I'm willing to go wherever this story takes me. I'm willing to go wherever you lead. I will walk down whatever path. I like my story because I know what my story happens tomorrow. It's not a good novel, but I like it for me. I'm going to get up in the morning. I'm going to do these 4 things I want to do. I'm going to go to bed. I'm going to hang out with the 6 people I want to hang out with. And that's all I'm going to do. We like that story. And yet, God's calling us to a greater one. And if we agree, if we say, you know what, we're going to step into God's story, what happens when we say that is that God can lead us anywhere. Bilbo Baggins, in talking to his young nephew in The Lord of the Rings, says, "It is dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door. You step out onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to." That's God's story. It's a scary thing, but that's why it's so grand and so big. Because when we step into God's story, we have no clue where we're going to be swept off to. When we're listening to his voice, like Eli told Samuel to listen to his voice, when we're willing to listen to that whisper, God can lead us anywhere. It's a scary thing to think about, but it's also how we can make a difference, how we can live out in the world. We are invited to be a part of this grand, amazing narrative. The story of the Bible is such a big, grand narrative. God weaves the story of creation and redemption over thousands of years so that people can know him. And we choose to follow God. When we choose to follow God, we step into this story, this grand narrative that's happened since before time began. We step into it and we take it to others. You see, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God created a place where we could dwell with God forever in perfection and be whole. But we sinned and broke that relationship between us and God. And ever since then, the whole earth has been groaning to get back to where it was before that sin. God walked with his people and they still sinned. God wiped out nearly the whole world with a flood and they still sinned. God separated the people, changed their language, and spread them around the earth and they still sinned. And then God began to speak to a man named Abraham. He called Abraham to be the father of a great nation of people. And he told Abraham that of all the people in the world, that they will be blessed through him. And yet, Abraham sinned. And the people who came from him sinned. But God said, they will be blessed through you. So from Abraham came Isaac, and then came Jacob and Esau. And from Jacob, who God changed his name to Israel, came the nation of Israel, God's chosen people. God chose Israel and set them a path so they would be light in a dark world. He showed them who he was and called them to follow him in a unique way. He blessed them and sustained them, not for their own sake, but so that they would be a blessing and a light to the nations. He called them to follow him, and he called them to invite others into his story. But the people of Israel did what everyone else did. They sinned. They chose their own way, and they focused more on themselves than on God. So God sent them into exile, reduced their influence in the world, but he did not abandon them. And all the while, he promised that one day he would come and with a true light, a Savior would come with a true light. One day he would come who would be the true Savior of the world. Then, thousands of years after Abraham's call, a son was born to a virgin girl in a tiny town called Bethlehem. That son grew up and told people about a God and his love for them. That son grew up and proclaimed joy for those who were suffering and freedom for the captives. That son grew up and cast out demons and healed the sick and called people to follow him. That Son of God chose to die for all of us. He took the sin of the world on his shoulders and paid the price for sin that we could never pay. For 3 days, the world mourned, sure that the darkness had won. But on that third day, Jesus rose victorious over death and sin. He rose and told his followers to go out and tell everyone they met that the story of redemption is true. He told his followers to go into all the world and tell them the story of how God never stopped coming after us, how we can choose forgiveness and Jesus. And that is the story that we are being invited into. That is the story that we are being invited to tell. That is the story that we are called to share with the nations. It's not a small story. It's not a small story. It is not a fantasy football story. It is not a my team won, so I'm in a good mood story. It is not a romance novel story. They shared this story, and it is life-changing, amazing, epic story, and we are invited to join. We are invited to jump in and be a part. The powerful play goes on, and we might contribute a verse. Flip real quick to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. If you want to flip over there, I can read it for you. Again, it's not going to be on the screen, but 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. It's going to speak a little bit about how we are called to be a royal priesthood. And as that's two things that matter a lot in the world that Peter was writing. The royalty would be, royal would be the emperor, the highest Roman power would be royal. And then the priesthood would be the highest Jewish power, this idea of the priest who kind of ran Jewish life. And between those two, it's what we're called to do. So 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, it says this: "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his," that's God's possession, "so that you may proclaim his praises, proclaim the praises of the one who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you're God's people. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." That's who we are. We are people who are joining in this story of God because we are a holy, royal priesthood. That we are people who are separated from God, that we are away from God, that we were cut off from God. And now God is inviting us to step into the story and be the priest in the world. Now, I'm not talking about Catholic priest kind of idea. I'm talking about this royal priesthood, people who step into the lives of our community, that are a blessing, that speak blessings, that are a part of helping the people around us understand and know who God is. So what's a royal priest to do? I'm going to give you three things. Again, your notes, you know what I'm saying? So you just have to keep them in your head, or maybe you brought your own piece of paper, whatever you want to do. Three things you need to do if you're going to be a royal priest. If you're going to step into the story of God, if you're going to be shaped by story and let the story shape you, there's three things you need to do. The first one is this. You need to, actually there's four things you need to do, but it's fine. You're not right. It's fine. We'll figure it out. I wrote the sermon yesterday. No, first thing is this. You need to listen to where God's leading. You got to listen to God. God is whispering all around us. God is whispering all around us the stories of things that are happening. I was hungry between Sunday school and actually between the services, so I walked over to Hardee's. And there's a guy, an old guy there, and a younger guy there. He's 31. I know that because he told me he was 31. And he said, I never thought I was going to live this long. He said, I thought always that I would, he was like, I never thought I'd live past 21. God's whispering in that moment. We had to speak to him. I'm like, hey, guy, you know what I'm saying? Say, hey, so what's worth living for now? He's like, everything's worth living for now. And then he walks out the door because he didn't want to talk to me because he knew I made a turn in the conversation, but that's fine. But you can see that God whispering, that conversation whispering around him. So the older guy was there, begins to tell me his story. Begins to tell me, hey, I went to your church once when y'all were doing stuff outside. He begins to speak about church people, and I begin to listen to his story. You see God whispering, hey, pay attention, pause, see this story, share this story with this person in this moment. So the first thing is this, we gotta listen to God. The second thing is this, the same thing in that story. You gotta listen to other people. You've got to listen to the stories that they tell. You need to be listening to the stories that people are telling about themselves and about their lives. There are a lot of people in the world that you think are the enemy. There are a lot of people in our lives that we tend to think those people are bad, those people are other, those people are choosing everything that we're not choosing. And we think, if we're not careful, it's really easy to think those people are just bad. They think all the things we don't think, and so they're just bad people. And if we don't listen to them, we're always going to think that. If we don't pause and go, well, what's going on? What helped shape you this way? What helped make you come to this person? What helped you? Who are you? What's your heart? What's your thing? If we don't start to see people as three-dimensional people created in the image of God and listen to their stories, we're always going to think of them as cookie cutter enemies that we can just come up with a good argument against. But we've got to listen to their stories. So we got to listen to where God's leading, because God's whispering, saying, this is where you need to go. And when God leads you to somewhere, we got to listen to their stories. And I heard the story. I sat down with this guy, and I was like, listen, tell me your story. He's like, I drove forever. And he's like, he was telling me what he was doing now. I was like, what'd you do before? He's like, I drove a truck. And then I got this really fascinating story. He drove like missiles and stuff around, and dynamite. He drove for the nation, for like government driving. And I'm like, that's really fascinating, telling me all this stuff. And so hear his story. And in that, you hear his heart, and you hear his desire, and you hear what's going on. As we talked a little bit about church, we talked about coming and being part. And because I listen. Let me tell you something. I am terrible at that stuff. I am much, much better at this than I am at that, because I'm always just like, okay, cool, thanks for your story, and walk off. I always forget that I'm like, oh yeah, I probably should like say Jesus here, because I always forget to do that. I'm just being honest with you. We gotta listen to God. We gotta listen to people's stories. And then we've got to tell our Jesus story to the world. So we listen to their stories, and then we tell our Jesus story. Verse 10 says, once you were not a people, but now you're God's people. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. That's the story of your life. You have been invited into God. You were not God's people, but now God has invited you back in. You did not have mercy, but now God has given you mercy. That's the story of our lives. That we were once far away, and now that we're brought close. So when we listen, what's just three things, huh? All right, so when we listen to God and where he's whispering, and then we listen to the stories people around us are telling, and then we tell them our story and how God changed their life. We don't have to give them 6 points in a prayer. We don't have to give them laid out kind of things about the gospel. We just need to tell them our story. Jesus Christ changed my life. I was lost, but now I'm found. I was separate, but now I'm close. This is who we are. That's our Jesus story that we need to tell the world. And we need to be telling that to every single person we meet. We are shaped by stories. We are shaped by this message of God. Stories are the very fabric of our lives. The Bible is not just the instruction manual for our life. It is the story of God and his love for the world. So we need to go and share that story with the world. Let me pray. God, I thank you for